Hello, everyone. Please sit down with your family to watch this beautiful story. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe to this channel to enjoy our daily story.
She was halfway through my laser tripwire grid, covered in olive oil and dragging a yoga mat behind her like a sled, when the prototype's targeting system chirped online. I watched in stunned silence through the garage's internal monitor as Karen, my HOA president and a one-woman army of neighborhood micromanagement, crawled past a crate labeled, "Do not disturb unless you're tired of breathing." It was 2:03 a.m. She was muttering something about illegal storage and property inspections, completely unaware that just one more inch and she'd trigger a non-lethal suppression net designed for cartel raids. That's when it hit me. This woman had no idea she'd just trespassed into the single most secure civilian garage in 3 counties. And it was about to introduce itself. The funny thing is, I moved here to avoid this kind of nonsense. After years building tactical systems for special operations, some of which the Pentagon still pretends don't exist, I decided to retire in peace. Bought a humble house on a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by retirees, yoga moms, and weekend grill warriors. It seemed like the perfect place to blend in, lay low, and maybe fix up some motorcycles or tinker with an occasional contract job in my garage. I even put up a privacy fence and installed blackout curtains just to make sure nobody got curious. But it turns out, if you try too hard not to draw attention, you end up drawing every last drop of it, especially from someone like Karen. She introduced herself on day 1 with a clipboard, a tight smile, and a tape measure. I was still unloading boxes from my truck when she wandered up and started measuring the height of my mailbox. Said she was just ensuring code compliance. I told her I'd comply with any rule that didn't violate constitutional law. She did not laugh. She glanced at my garage, double-reinforced titanium doors with a biometric scanner, and gave it a suspicious frown. "What's in there?" she asked. "Tools," I answered, which wasn't a lie. Just a little incomplete. By the end of week 1, she'd already filed 3 complaints. One for the unusual humming noise coming from my property, spoiler alert, it was the battery core stabilizer running diagnostics, one for suspiciously armored trash bins, and one for intimidating landscaping. That last one was because I used gravel instead of mulch. Still, I played nice. Waved when I saw her. Didn't engage. Figured she'd get bored and move on. But with Karen, curiosity is a full-time job, and I had just become her obsession. It escalated when the HOA issued a bizarre new rule about garage inspections. She claimed it was to ensure community safety and eliminate unregistered machinery. It was clearly a personal mission. I attended the meeting, leaned back in the folding chair, and asked, "What exactly are we inspecting for?" "Secret robot armies." A few folks chuckled. Karen didn't. Her eyes locked onto me like I was Osama bin Welding Torch. I told her flat out, "No one enters my garage but me. It's not just a hobby space. It's a secure lab, and even the city has signed off on that." From then on, I caught her lurking near the bushes by my driveway. Once, I found her walking slowly past my house while pretending to text. Another time, she actually tossed a frisbee over my fence and asked if she could pop in real quick to retrieve it. I tossed it back over the fence and said, "No need to thank me." She did not thank me. That brings us back to tonight. I was asleep when my silent alarm went off. The system showed a breach from the east perimeter. The doggy door I hadn't sealed yet because, well, I don't have a dog. That was my mistake. I grabbed the tablet and opened the garage feed, and there she was, wearing a headlamp, elbow deep in Crisco, sliding across the epoxy floor like a cross between Mission Impossible and a badly staged yoga video. The system identified her heat signature, cross-referenced her against known threats, which now hilariously includes HOA board members, and prepped the net launcher. I had 90 seconds to deactivate it before she became the world's angriest spring roll. I bolted out of bed, threw on my jeans, and entered the garage through the emergency side door. My voice command froze the net system just in time, but not before she shrieked and scrambled behind a workbench. That's when she saw it, the rack of inert prototypes, the armor plates, the tactical tools labeled with military codes and serial numbers. She pointed at them with wide eyes, yelling, "I knew it! I knew you were making bombs!" I stared at her, deadpan. "Lady, that's a smart wrench. It tightens bolts based on vibration analytic. Calm down." But Karen was on a roll. "This is a clear violation of city ordinances. No one should have access to this kind of equipment unless they're with the government." I blinked. "I was with the government. You just broke into what's effectively a federally audited lab." She didn't like that answer. She tried to make a break for it, slipping on a coolant spill and knocking over a tactical helmet, which promptly lit up and began scanning her face. I shut it down before it deployed its voice-activated flash beacon. At this point, she was half covered in gear, shrieking about illegal weapons labs and citizens' arrests. I calmly helped her up, walked her back toward the door, and told her she had 10 seconds to leave before I reported her for felony trespassing. Her mouth opened to argue, but something in my tone, or maybe the drone whirring quietly in the corner, finally got through to her. She stormed off, covered in synthetic grease and tangled in a coil of comms wire, muttering about bringing the entire HOA down on my head. I went back inside, locked the garage down, and sighed. Most people fear burglars or teenagers tipping over trash cans. I had a much weirder problem. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she'd just entered the kind of space that could get both of us on a federal watch list. She thought I was hiding something from the neighborhood. And now, thanks to her, I might have to show the neighborhood exactly who I am. Karen stood in my driveway the next morning, arms crossed, wrapped in a hoodie that still had traces of synthetic netting clinging to the sleeve. Her sunglasses were enormous, likely more for drama than sunlight. I was sipping coffee on my porch, fully expecting her appearance after last night's little trespassing adventure. I even made an extra cup. She didn't say anything at first, just glared at me like I had personally rewritten the HOA handbook to exclude her from humanity. Finally, she spoke through clenched teeth. "You assaulted me with machines. There are laws, you know." I didn't even blink. I just raised my mug and said, "Good morning, Karen. Fancy some Crisco with your legal threats." She huffed and stomped down the path like a woman on a mission, leaving behind the faintest trail of oil stains on the concrete. My garage was locked tighter than Fort Knox, now triple-sealed and running a full diagnostic sweep every 5 minutes. What Karen didn't know, and hopefully never would, was that she had tripped a Level 2 breach protocol, which meant the system had logged her biometric footprint, voice print, and every motion she made inside. If she so much as sneezed on my driveway again, it would chirp a warning. The real headache started around noon, when 2 local patrol officers knocked on my door. Nothing aggressive, just a routine follow-up about a domestic disturbance complaint. I invited them in, offered them coffee, and showed them the security footage of Karen crawling into my garage with the determination of a raccoon in a vending machine. One of the officers laughed so hard he snorted. The other tried to stay professional, but I saw him mouth the words, "Oh my God," when Karen got caught in the autonet. They asked what I did for work, and I gave them the legally vague version. Consultant for tactical systems and logistics. Government adjacent. They nodded, said it made sense given the equipment, and told me they'd file the whole thing as a non-incident with a stern warning to the complainant. Then they asked if I'd be willing to send them a copy of the footage, just for training purposes. I obliged. But Karen wasn't done. By the next morning, the HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting, citing unconfirmed but concerning reports of military-grade installations within a residential garage. The flyer was practically handwritten in all caps. I showed up out of principle, not expecting much. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse, decorated like a dentist's waiting room and full of people who wore lanyards with their names on them despite knowing everyone for years. Karen stood at the front with a projector and a single slide that said, "Who is he?" in red Comic Sans. She launched into a bizarre tirade about neighborhood safety, government secrecy, and the unnatural quietness of my garage. She claimed to have heard explosions. I had tested a sonic barrier shield once. It barely cracked 60 decibels, and she accused me of harboring unlicensed explosives. I let her talk for 5 full minutes before calmly raising my hand. "I'd like to remind the board," I said, "that Karen broke into my private property, got herself tangled in a legally certified anti-theft deterrent system, and is now trying to reverse blame me because she doesn't like the way my garage door looks." A few neighbors chuckled. One woman nodded and whispered something about Karen needing a hobby. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a cactus. "This isn't about me," she snapped. "This is about safety. I've done the research. No civilian garage needs biometric locks or infrared tripwires unless they're hiding something dangerous." I folded my arms. "Or unless they're preventing dangerous people from snooping around inside." That shut her up. Temporarily. The board ultimately ruled that unless I was proven to be violating HOA codes, which I wasn't, they couldn't demand entry into my garage or dictate what kind of locks I used. Karen stormed out, muttering about appealing to the city council, or maybe the FBI. I considered mailing her a copy of the Constitution, just for laugh. 3 days of peace followed, which in Karen years is roughly equivalent to 3 centuries. I should have known it was the calm before the storm. On the 4th day, I noticed something odd in my trash bins, an empty ammunition case I didn't recognize. Not mine, wrong caliber, and with a suspiciously fresh fingerprint smudge. Then I found a canister labeled "Tactical Lubricant" in the recycling. The label looked like it had been printed from a home printer. I don't use tactical lubricant. I use ceramic coat stabilizer, which smells like mint and doesn't come in neon orange cans. That evening, 2 HOA board members showed up at my door asking questions about contraband. Karen had apparently filed a complaint claiming she'd seen dangerous materials around my property and had proof from items I'd discarded improperly. I laughed and offered to show them my security footage, which included Karen sneaking around my garbage bins at 2:11 a.m., gloved up and planting items like she was auditioning for a crime procedural. The footage was clear enough to show her adjusting her fanny pack with the words, "HOA Enforcement," written on it in glitter glue. The board members left embarrassed and promised to talk to Karen. I didn't hold my breath. Instead, I sent a quick message to an old contact, Lieutenant Ramirez, now working as a field coordinator for Military Liaison Project. We'd served together on classified ops years ago, and we'd stayed in touch. When I told him the situation, he actually laughed over the phone for a solid 30 seconds. Then he said, "I think it's time we paid your HOA a little visit." That's when the plans started forming. Ramirez would bring a small unit of demo specialists disguised as a civilian task force to conduct a safety certification walkthrough. We'd time it during the next HOA meeting, play it totally by the book, but with just enough subtle showmanship to make Karen sweat bullets. Of course, all this had to be legal, so we filed for a surprise safety demonstration request with the city under an experimental tech grant. They approved it in under 24 hours. Apparently, someone upstairs liked the idea of educating homeowners about modern defense tools. I spent the rest of that week tuning up my prototypes, reinforcing the garage, and running rehearsals with Ramirez's crew. They'd bring the theatric. I'd handle the neighborhood optic. All we had to do was wait for the right moment. Karen had pushed the wrong buttons. She thought she was dealing with some backyard mechanic hoarding rusty junk. She didn't realize she had tried to outmaneuver someone who built tools to disable entire facilities in under 90 seconds. She thought she was winning. But the garage wasn't her enemy. I was. And I was just getting warmed up. Karen's idea of revenge was the sort of thing that made you wonder how she functioned daily without accidentally setting herself on fire. It began with a cardboard box on my porch. No return address. Just a sloppy label reading illegal weapons evidence. I opened it carefully, half expecting it to hiss. Inside were 2 paintball guns, one of those plastic toy grenades that lights up and makes a clicking noise, and what appeared to be a homemade manual titled, How to Make Dangerous Stuff in a Garage, confiscated from Rex. The grammar alone was a crime. I stared at it for a full minute before laughing so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. She had gone full tinfoil hat and was now trying to frame me using sporting gear and bad arts and craft. Of course, the HOA got involved immediately. Karen had submitted evidence that I was stockpiling weapons and distributing literature on how to make bombs. I knew the only thing I was about to detonate was her credibility. At their emergency review, she dramatically dumped the paintball guns onto the table and proclaimed that I was a danger to every man, woman, and squirrel in the subdivision. One board member coughed to hide a laugh. Another squinted at the toy grenade, pressed the button, and jumped when it blinked and made laser sounds. Karen leapt back as if she'd just thrown live ammunition. "See? Dangerous," she shouted. I cleared my throat and asked if I could respond. They nodded, so I opened my folder and handed out copies of a city-approved document that verified my workshop as a certified prototype lab. The next sheet was a screenshot from my camera system showing Karen wearing gloves and stuffing the paintball guns into the box at 3:07 a.m. behind her garage. The next image was her slipping and falling into her recycling bin as she tried to sneak back into her yard. There was no dramatic music, but the looks on their faces played the soundtrack for me. One board member asked, almost gently, if she needed help from a mental health professional. She left the meeting red-faced and muttering something about fake documents and deeper corruption. Still, the damage was done. Even though I'd cleared my name for the 15th time, it was obvious Karen wasn't giving up. That same night, I did a full system audit on my property: drones, cameras, sensors, the works. Everything checked out, except for a tiny blip near my shed's roof. It turned out to be a small drone the size of a grapefruit, wedged under the overhang. Homemade, cheap, and terribly loud if you knew what to listen for. It was broadcasting a weak signal, probably tied into a phone app. I took it apart in 10 minutes and found a tiny note inside. It read, "Keeping an eye on you. You can't hide from the HOA." That was when I decided to stop playing defense. I reached out to Ramirez again. I told him I needed a favor, something small but showy. He chuckled and said, "We still owe you for the Corsica incident." "What are you thinking?" I explained the plan, and he said it was doable, legal, even educational. Within 2 days, we'd arranged a community security demonstration, backed by a legitimate contractor who partners with local municipalities. They'd show off gear, explain proper deterrence, and casually validate my garage as one of the safest installations in the county. It would be public, HOA-sanctioned, and most importantly, unmissable for someone like Karen. While the pieces moved into place, Karen took her chaos to new height. She started handing out flyers warning neighbors about the man with war machines, hosted a backyard Q&A on suburban threats, and tried to file for a noise violation against the humming of my electric stabilizer. The city noise officer came out, ran a decibel check, and told her my garage was quieter than a refrigerator. She looked ready to explode. Instead, she cried. Actual tears. In front of the officer, in front of the neighbors, like a child who'd been told her imaginary friend didn't exist. She pointed at me and wailed, "He's hiding something." "I know it." I didn't say a word. I just let it simmer. Then came the day of the demo. It started like any neighborhood gathering: folding chairs, plastic cups, one overly enthusiastic guy grilling hot dogs. The HOA members showed up reluctantly, worried this would become another Karen circus. I stood back, sipping lemonade, watching as Ramirez and his crew unloaded the gear. They were in plain clothes, but the equipment was sleek, polished, and just tactical enough to make the HOA squirm. They demonstrated a self-locking vault door similar to mine, explaining its civilian applications for workshops, data storage, and safety. they walked through a drone detection system that pinged anytime unauthorized surveillance entered a protected zone. Karen turned white. She recognized her own drone's signature on the display. Ramirez smiled politely and added, "This model intercepted a homemade device just last week. Crude design, very illegal. Potential felony if weaponized." Karen stepped back into the crowd. Then came the final bit, a prototype demonstration of my personal contribution. Ramirez introduced me as a retired technical advisor with extensive experience in security solutions, which was technically true. I walked to the front, held up a remote, and activated a small platform that opened from the ground, revealing a camouflaged bot no larger than a Roomba. It extended a small arm, waved at the crowd, and projected a hologram that read, "Neighborhood Watch 2.0. Gasps, applause, and one faint scream from Karen. I didn't even need to look at her. I could feel her meltdown brewing. The demonstration ended with Ramirez handing the HOA a printed certification stating that my garage had passed the highest standards of residential safety and compliance. The board thanked me. Several neighbors clapped me on the back. Karen disappeared into the clubhouse bathrooms and didn't come out for 30 minutes. Later that evening, I reviewed the footage. My garage's internal logs showed Karen trying to access the lock again around midnight. This time, she didn't get past the retinal scanner. It blared a warning, took a snapshot, and lit up the keypad with a friendly message. "Access denied. Please contact administrator or go home, Karen." That was the final straw. She didn't call the cops this time. No, she called a private security company that advertised rapid neighborhood interventions. I watched from my living room as 3 men in knockoff tactical gear strolled up my driveway with flashlights and printed badges that looked like they came from a cereal box. One of them knocked, very politely, and asked to inspect my workshop. I smiled and invited them in. 10 minutes later, they were sitting in lawn chairs in my garage, sipping soda, watching drone footage of themselves approaching my property like it was a live-streamed nature documentary. When I explained what they'd almost walked into, specifically the auto-defense routines, they decided to write a report recommending I offer them a job in system design. They left in peace, asked for selfies, and promised to send Karen a refund. Karen had tried everything. Framing me, accusing me, spying on me, hiring help. But every time she pulled a move, I had her outmatched, outclassed, and outmaneuvered. She thought she was in a power struggle. She didn't know I had stopped struggling and started planning her permanent checkmate. The next HOA meeting was held 2 days later, and this time, the anticipation in the air could have powered the entire block. Word had spread fast about the demonstration, about the failed security goons Karen hired, and most deliciously, about the footage of her face being lit up by a "Go home, Karen" message. I didn't plan to speak at the meeting, but I made sure to arrive early and take a front row seat, just close enough to make her sweat. She walked in late, looking like she'd aged 10 years, clutching a manila folder like it contained classified documents. Her eyes darted across the room, looking for allies, but all she found were sideways glances and neighbors pretending to be busy with their phones. The room hushed when the board president called the meeting to order. Karen immediately stood up and demanded to present new evidence. She began reading from a typed report accusing me of maintaining military-grade weapons, surveillance infrastructure capable of violating privacy laws, and high-risk hardware endangering civilian life. The board looked exhausted. The treasurer leaned forward and quietly asked, "Karen, didn't we just get a certification stating the exact opposite?" She waved him off. "It's all a cover-up. He's got these people fooled. But I have proof. Audio." I intercepted a transmission from inside his garage. It mentioned classified equipment. At that, I actually smiled. That transmission she heard? It was a training simulation loop I'd built years ago that played random military jargon to test soundproofing. It was literally nonsense designed to throw off eavesdroppers. Apparently, Karen had recorded it with a homemade bug and now thought she'd cracked the code to a secret arsenal. I raised my hand and said I'd be happy to clarify. That audio she's referencing? It's from a fake mission scenario I built for a soundproofing test. It includes phrases like deploy the toaster drone and flank the refrigerator zone. You're welcome to hear the rest. A few people chuckled. The board president looked like he was reconsidering every life choice that led him to HOA leadership. Karen didn't flinch. She opened her folder and held up a series of printed photos, grainy, low-resolution shots of my garage from what must have been her drone. Most of the images were angled through tree branches or obstructed by shadows. One of them was upside down. She slapped them down on the table and shouted, "This is what's in our neighborhood." I waited a beat, then slowly reached into my own folder and laid out a laminated city permit, a federal clearance waiver for prototype storage, and a signed affidavit from the contractor who had visited. Then I slid over a full high-res image from my own drone showing Karen climbing her fence, clearly holding the camera she'd used to spy on me. The difference in quality was dramatic. Mine looked like it was taken by a Hollywood studio. Hers looked like it had been printed from a potato. The board reviewed the documents, whispering among themselves. Finally, the president looked up and said, "Karen, you've accused Mr. Rex of very serious violations. But so far, all you've presented is bad photography and audio from what might be a children's cartoon. Unless you have something concrete, I think this discussion is over." Karen looked stunned, like she couldn't process the idea that she wasn't winning. Her voice cracked when she shouted, "He's dangerous." That's when Ramirez walked in. He wasn't wearing his usual gear. This time, he was in full formal attire, with a government ID badge visible on a lanyard. Behind him were two officials from the city's Emergency Preparedness Division. Ramirez walked to the front, nodded to the board, and politely asked for a moment. "My name is Lieutenant Ramirez. I'm here on behalf of the Tactical Infrastructure and Civilian Integration Program. We recently completed a safety review on Mr. Rex's workshop, and I'd like to officially present the results." Karen tried to interrupt. He ignored her completely. He handed over a sleek packet, professionally bound, with graphs, assessments, and commendations. Then he turned to the room and added, "It's rare to find a private citizen using their background to improve neighborhood readiness. Mr. Rex's systems are not only compliant, they're exemplary. In fact, we've asked him to assist with designing prototype civilian safety shelters for emergency zones." Murmurs filled the room. Ramirez continued, "That includes systems that detect unauthorized surveillance, like drones, bugs, and cameras. Which, incidentally, is how we became aware of illegal monitoring originating from this community." He didn't name her. He didn't have to. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a broken puppet. She sat down so hard her chair squeaked. After the meeting, the neighborhood was buzzing. Everyone suddenly wanted to talk to me. One guy asked if I could install a perimeter sensor around his koi pond. Another neighbor offered to trade fresh eggs for drone advice. The once quiet man across the street stopped by with a six-pack and said, "Didn't think you were cool. Turns out you're Batman." Karen, meanwhile, vanished from public view. Rumor had it she was trying to transfer HOA authority to someone else for medical reasons. I didn't care what excuse she used. She was done. But of course, she had one last play. A week later, I received a summons. Karen had filed a small claims lawsuit against me for emotional distress, citing mental trauma caused by tactical equipment and government deception. Her filing included screenshots of our neighbor group chat where people made jokes about her. She also listed the Go Home Karen keypad message as harassment via electronic device. I showed up to court in a collared shirt and jeans. She arrived with a binder that looked like it had been duct-taped back together after being chewed by a lawnmower. Her opening argument went off the rails immediately. She claimed I was manufacturing combat robots and had turned her into a national security scapegoat. The judge asked what her evidence was, and she said, "Common sense." Then I presented my security footage, city permits, military clearance, Ramirez's letter, and a copy of her own drone's telemetry log, which my system had collected and stored. The judge spent 5 minutes reading, looked up, and said, "Ma'am, not only is this case without merit, but you may want to reconsider how often you trespass into high-security garages." Karen tried to say something else, but the judge banged the gavel. Case dismissed. I walked out of the courtroom into bright sunlight. Ramirez texted me one word: checkmate. Back home, I sat on my porch, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes in front of my driveway. The sun was setting. The garage hummed softly in the background, running a systems check. For the first time in weeks, it felt like peace. Karen had come into my life thinking she could bully her way through suspicion and control. She thought power came from clipboards and loud voices. But power, real power, comes from knowing what to build and exactly when to use it. Peace in the neighborhood felt almost unnatural at first. For weeks, I had been in a constant state of mental DEFCON 1, with cameras flickering, alerts pinging, and drones doing slow figure eights over my backyard. But now it was quiet. No midnight rustling. No bizarre HOA flyers in the mailbox. No Karen. Her house stayed dark for a few days, the shutters closed like it had entered permanent lockdown. Some neighbors said she'd gone on medical leave from the HOA. Others whispered about an enforced sabbatical after a particularly intense board intervention. I didn't care which version was true. What mattered was that the campaign of chaos had finally ended. But the silence didn't last long. Not because of Karen. This time, the neighborhood decided it was time to celebrate the return to sanity, and surprisingly, to thank me. It started when old Mr. Halbier from 3 doors down came over with a smoked brisket and asked if I could install a camera over his garage. Then Sheila, who once reported me for not edging my lawn to HOA specs, offered to host a potluck in my honor. Apparently, seeing Karen implode had a unifying effect. They weren't just grateful I'd stood up to her. They were entertained. Some of them had even turned the security footage into memes. One particularly viral one showed her crawling under the laser grid with the caption, "Karen vs. the Pentagon." I didn't want the attention, but I appreciated the gesture. The potluck was scheduled for the weekend, and the entire cul-de-sac transformed. Folding tables lined the sidewalk. Neighbors brought lawn chairs, grilled hot dogs, played music, and turned my driveway into a makeshift command center. Someone brought cupcakes with drone toppers. Another guy brought his old ham radio and tried to sync it to my perimeter alarm just to feel cool. I ran a light demo for the kids, showing them a non-lethal sensor bot that chirped when it detected motion. They followed it around like ducklings. About halfway through the event, the HOA board arrived with a surprise. They presented me with a certificate, completely unofficial but printed on fancy paper, that read, "Honorary HOA Defense Specialist, Defender of Driveways, Keeper of the Tactical Code." It was ridiculous, and honestly kind of touching. I thanked them, shook hands, even smiled for a few group photos. Then the board president leaned in and said quietly, "We're also officially updating the HOA guidelines to include Karen-proofing clauses. No more garage inspections. No more drone loopholes. You shut her down so hard we're rewriting policy." It should have ended there. But of course, Karen had to make one final, flaming exit. 3 days after the potluck, as I was running diagnostics on a new solar-charged emergency system, I got an alert on my phone. It wasn't a breach, just an unusual motion pattern on my roof. I checked the feed. There she was, Karen, in broad daylight, climbing onto my back porch with a ladder she'd borrowed from someone's shed. She wore all black, as if that somehow made her invisible at 3 p.m. in July. In her hands, she held a large manila envelope. A neighbor's Ring camera caught her muttering to herself, "I'll serve him myself if the system won't." She was trying to deliver legal paperwork, again. I didn't confront her. I just let the system do its thing. As soon as she touched the edge of my garage door, the speakers activated and played a cheerful recorded message. "Hi Karen. Please step away from the property. This is your third uninvited visit. This action is being recorded and has triggered an automated notification to the local precinct." She froze, looked around, then tried to act casual as she tiptoed off the property. She didn't even make it to the sidewalk before a patrol car pulled up. Apparently, the officers had been following the alerts ever since her failed court stunt. They asked her a few questions, looked at the envelope, then walked over and handed it to me with a shrug. "Looks like she filed another small claims complaint. Something about defamation by keypad message." I laughed. "It's fine. Toss it in the bin. I've got more important things to do, like building a motion-activated sprinkler that can spell her name." They laughed too. The officer paused and added, "For what it's worth, you've got fans at the station. That drone footage was better than most of our training videos." That night, I finished the sprinkler. It didn't actually spell her name, but it did track movement and release a colored mist if triggered. I called it the Karen Cloud. I installed it in my front yard, near the mailbox, just in case she got any more ideas about surveillance. The next day, a neighborhood kid ran through it and squealed with joy. Apparently, tactical deterrents can double as playground attractions. Later that week, a letter arrived from the city. Not from the Code Enforcement Office or the court. This one was from the Public Safety Commissioner, thanking me for my involvement in the tactical readiness demo and inviting me to join a civilian advisory council focused on integrating security technology into urban planning. I stared at the letter, then looked around my garage. Half of the gear in there had started as jokes, or side projects, or experiments built just to stay sharp. Now, somehow, this absurd HOA saga had turned them into community asset. It felt right. I said yes. As for Karen, she sold her house 3 weeks later. Rumor had it she moved to a gated community on the other side of the city, where the HOA was run by a retired judge and a committee of retired lawyers. Probably the only place left where her brand of control might be tolerated, or at least properly litigated. Her house was quickly bought by a young couple who asked me if they could install motion lighting. I offered to help. They brought cookies. No clipboards. Months passed. The neighborhood adjusted to peace like it had forgotten what noise felt like. People still asked me for help here and there, security installs, advice, tech tweaks, but mostly they just waved and said hi. My garage, once a fortress of solitude, had become a symbol of the community. I even installed a side entrance that opened into a clean demo space, just for neighborhood workshop. The HOA funded some of it, unofficially, out of leftover landscaping budget. On one of those calm evenings, I stood in the driveway watching a drone hover over the park nearby. Not one of mine. Just a recreational model flown by a teenager who'd attended one of the workshop. He gave me a thumbs up from across the street. I returned it. Karen had trespassed into my garage thinking she was cracking open a mystery. She thought she was pulling back the curtain on something dark and dangerous. What she actually did was awaken the very thing she feared, a quiet, well-prepared, unshakable wall of logic and precision. Her world was built on control and panic. Mine was built on calibration and timing. She wanted to catch me off guard. Instead, she helped turn me into the neighborhood's last line of defense. And every time that garage door opened, it reminded everyone, especially her, that if you poke the wrong bear, you might just end up in a tactical net surrounded by laser tripwires, Crisco, and your own ridiculous expectations.